Hi, folks, welcome back. Here we are with our next recorded lecture. This is for Philosophy 110. I'm your instructor, Victor Fabian Abuenas-Guerra. And today we're going to still be talking about ethical theories, but we're going to be getting into care ethics, which, as we're going to see, is pretty different. So with that said, let's go ahead and start up these slides from the beginning. Okay. Oh, 1 second. There we go. So we're gonna go ahead and get some background. As we're gonna see, in order to understand the buildup, the historical buildup towards care ethics, we need to understand how philosophers have traditionally, philosophers in the West, by the West again, I mean the United States, Britain, the UK, and Australia, and other English-speaking areas, how those type of philosophers have treated rationality versus emotion or the passions. And consequently, as we're going to see, also the place of women in philosophy. So this is going to get into gender a good amount. And I do want to give a content warning here for some sexism and misogyny. So there's your content warning. With that said, we'll look at what Plato had to say about these topics, Kant, the psychologist Kohlberg. They're going to be very important because as we're going to see, one of the first care ethicist, Carol Gilligan, is going to be reacting to Kohlberg. Of course, we're going to see how Hume and Rorty were, in a sense, pattern breakers, and they did give a place for the passions or emotions, but they were exceptions in the usual tradition. Keep that in mind. We'll see what Gilligan has to say and why she is important to care ethics from her book In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development. And finally, for today, we'll see what Noddings contributed to the development of care ethics in carrying a feminine approach to ethics and moral education. And on our next lecture, we'll look at the Collins piece in of itself, and we'll try to distill sort of the core of care ethics by looking at 4 key claims that Collins believes most or all care ethicists are committed to. Because we're going to see care ethics is a relatively new ethical theory. It was developed around the 60s or 70s, I believe, as opposed to some of the other ones which have been around for some of the other ones that we've studied, which have been around for about, a century or 2 or 3. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and start doing some history. Again, content warning for a lot of sexism. A lot of sexism. Here we go. If my computer, there you go. So good. So Plato, what does he have to say about reason versus the appetites? To begin, Plato believes that the soul, the human soul, has 3 parts, and the human soul is kind of, in a sense, the mind. And he believes that the best part of the soul is the rational part. He believes that there's also a spirited part, which part that kind of gets like angry, and that's the part that you want soldiers to have. And finally, there's the desires or the appetites. So in the Phaedrus, right, and then in his book, The Phaedrus, it's a dialogue of Plato. He basically has this analogy which kind of tells us who he thinks or what part of the soul he thinks should rule within our body, within our soul. He says that, look, the rational part of your soul is like a charioteer. They're the driver. And the spirited part of you, the angry part, the honorable part, the part that gets angry, the part that you want to be angry at disgusting or immoral things, that part of your soul is a white noble horse on the right side, pulling the chariot, of course. But the desires, the appetitive part, the emotions, is the black, ugly horse on the left. And you can see there what each part of the chariot loves, desires, their virtues, their vices, and what they're associated with in the body. Furthermore, in The Republic, another one of Plato's very famous works, he basically says that, look, society should be split up into a class system where the guardians are the rulers of the city and they're the most rational. And essentially, the most rational among them should be a philosopher king. Finally, as the soldiers, the military police are the ones that have the most spirit in their soul, that the spirit part rules over them. They're not as good as the guardians, but they're still pretty good. They're above those merchants and workers who let the appetitive part of their soul rule them. Of course, it still needs to be controlled. Those merchants and workers, the lower class, still need to be controlled by the guardians and the auxiliaries and the soldiers to keep them in place. Keep that in mind. Kant on emotions doesn't really give it a great place in contrast to reason or rationality. He's often seen as a stoic, that is, emotions sort of mislead us and make us irrational. He thinks that reason is our only true guide. He is a rationalist. According to the philosopher Oliver Sanson, he says Kant himself does provide some basis for ascribing this view to him, for he famously says that feelings and inclinations are so far from having an important worth that it must be the universal wish of every rational being to be altogether free from them. So he kind of sees them as an impediment or an obstacle to clear thinking. He doesn't like emotions, the appetites, and again, this is from a very long history of thousands of years, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. Of course, as we're going to see now, though, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, they didn't really have a very good opinion of women doing philosophy. We've mentioned the Republic before. As we're going to see, the opinion of all of these philosophers, a lot of these male philosophers, is not great, but it also associates men more with rationality and women more with emotion. So, for instance, Plato in the Republic says women and men have the same nature in respect to the guardianship of the state, save insofar as that one is weaker and the other is stronger. So regarding the guardianship, as we talked earlier, being philosophical and being rational, women are weaker in that regard, according to Plato, one of the greatest philosophers, according to us. So Aristotle's Politics, right? Another one of his work, he basically says that women are incomplete or deformed men, essentially. He says, look, the male, unless constituted in some respect only contrary to nature, is by nature more expert at leading than the female, and the elder and completer than the younger and incomplete. So the woman is kind of like a child and incomplete and should follow orders. The relation to female is by nature a relation of superior to inferior and ruler to ruled. The slave, that's another bad thing about Aristotle. Even though he came up with virtue ethics and he's very smart for coming up with that, he did believe in something called natural slaves, which is not great. But anyways, the slave is wholly lacking the deliberative element. The female has it, but lacks authority. The child has it, but it is incomplete. So women don't have authority in deliberation. Regarding the history of animals, Aristotle says, wherefore women are more compassionate, more readily made to weep, more jealous and more querulous, fonder of railing, and more contentious. The female is also more subject to repression of spirits and despair than the male. She is also more shameless and false. I'm not going to read the rest. You kind of get the point. The basic idea here again is that these philosophers have associated rationality with maleness and emotions with femaleness. It's important to know that from the Greeks, the word hysteria, the word hysteria comes from the Greeks. It comes from the word hystera. There shouldn't be an either, which means uterus. Which basically, up until the 1980s, according to the American Psychiatric Association, they had the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, which tells us all the mental disorders. Hysteria was one in there up until 1980s, and mostly women were diagnosed with it. And the Greeks basically believe that you're acting crazy if you have hysteria because your uterus is acting up. So it's particularly a woman emotional thing. There's also this Greek idea of akrasia, coming from the idea of lacking command, which means that you're in a state of mind in which you act against your better judgment or your better will because of weakness of will or due to emotions. In other words, we would call that today acting crazy, and that also comes from the Greeks. So Kant on woman, he wasn't much better himself, right? On the observations on the feeling of the beautiful and sublime, which is pretty popular, famous work of him. He basically just goes on and on for a long time, saying how women are essentially very beautiful and very compassionate, and he really likes that. However, they don't have the capacity to abide by rational principles. The idea of a principle being sort of a rule that you apply to a lot of different cases. Obviously, the most important principle for him is the categorical imperative, which we've already seen. So finally, in 1927, we have the psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, right? And he basically says, look, humans go through stages of moral development from young age to adulthood. So at the very beginning, when we're 3 to 7 years old, we have pre-conventional morality, where we say that moral reasoning is based on reward and punishment. Then we have conventional morality when we're 8 to 13, in which we say that moral reasoning is based on external ethics. And then as we approach morality, we have post-conventional morality, which is moral reasoning based on personal ethics. And at the very top, we have principle, kind of similar to how Kant said, right? Rational principle. And Lawrence Kohlberg, right? The Harvard psychologist, according to Carol Tavris in the New York Times, 1982, basically summarized the work. And Lawrence Kohlberg argued, that women tend to get stuck at stage 3, where standards of morality and goodness depend on pleasing and helping others. Women rarely rise to the sublime stage 6, where morality stems from ultimate principles that transcend self-interest and nationality. So women, according to a very famous psychologist, are morally stunted, either due to nature or nurture. Regardless, they are morally stunted. Of course, not all philosophers thought like this. David Hume was an exception. What did David Hume think? He's best known for his empiricism and skepticism, but he's also a moral sentimentalist, the philosopher David Hume, Scottish. He said that morality depends largely on developing the right sentiments, passions, or emotions. In a treatise of human nature, he has this very long introduction, or long paragraph, where he basically says, look, philosophers love to essentially downgrade emotions and passions all the time and raise reason and rationality to the highest authority. But I think that's wrong. That's completely wrong-headed. And he famously says, it's not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching my finger, because I have an itch on my finger. It's a very infamous quote that he said. Basically, if he says that if I do that failure in morality to scratch my own finger as opposed to save the world, that's not a failure of rationality. That's a failure of having the right emotion, of having the right passion. Basically, the whole world being destroyed should make me feel revolted. But if I don't feel that, I'm not going to be motivated by that. And this part, rationality, according to him, is only ever instrumental. It helps us get what we would desire or want, but it cannot decide what we want or desire. That is up to passion itself. So the passions and emotions, they tell you what you want, and your rationality helps you get there. But again, it's always your passion and your emotions that tell you what you want. So we can consider, for example, he wouldn't know this, right? He wouldn't know this, but he was doing to some extent psychology. And today with our psychology, we would know this. The idea of the psychopath. Psychopaths are often seen as very intelligent, very conniving, often very educated, but they lack emotion, empathy, and they act very immoral. Would we say that a psychopath in acting immoral, that they are somehow unintelligent, or will we more rightly say, according to David Hume, I presume, that they are unfeeling? Richard Rorty, he's an American pragmatist philosopher in Human Rights, Rationality, and Sentimentality. He basically says, look, in order to make the world a better place, we're not going to sit down and argue with bigots and Nazis and fascists and tell them, hey, those people that you're persecuting, they're human too, and let me give you a rational argument as to why. He says, no, the way you get people to give human rights to others is to appeal to security and sympathy, to make the oppressor and the oppressed more secure, and to make the oppressor in particular more sympathetic through moral education, which relies on sentimentality, Richard Rorty said. So with all of that said, let's get to our first female thinker that we're talking about here, right? Carol Gilligan is still alive, yes. I think she's about 80-something. She's an American psychologist. She's known as the originator of the ethics of care, or care ethics. And she was formerly Kohlberg's research assistant, and she heavily criticized his stages of moral development as male-centric, essentially. He says, look, women were not morally stunted, Kohlberg. They just speak in a different voice when it comes to morality and development. There is a male voice and a female voice, and one is not better than the other. They're just different, either due to nature or nurture, doesn't matter, but one is not morally stunted, or the other. He says, it is from the Collins reading. Gilligan found women did not appeal to general principles or make absolute assertions about right or wrong. Instead, they focus on the limitations of any particular resolution and describe the conflicts that remain. The seeming indecisiveness resulted from their perception of many conflicting responsibilities to their family members, to their friends, to themselves, and to those more distant. Paradigmatically, Gillen described Amy, a subject who saw the world as a narrative of relationships that extends over time in a world that coheres through human connection rather than through systems of rules. So the basic idea here is that in care ethics, relationships are important. They take a prime role, as does that role for emotion. And that is actually the basis for ethics in the female voice, according to her. And she takes the idea of Amy, the example of a stereotypical, or I guess paradigm woman, according to her, that's just sort of thrown into the world, and that women are sort of pulled into multiple different directions due to their human connections and their human responsibilities, and that this indecisiveness is not a bad thing, but it's actually them sort of weighing out all the relationships and the connections, and that's not bad, that's good. Nel Noddings, she took this a little further, right? She was an American philosopher, feminist, and educator, and she took Gilligan's work and approached it from the point of view more of ethics than of psychology, but still informed by psychology, right? So while Gilligan said that the male voice and the female voice were just as good, Nel Noddings actually said that the female voice, or as we're going to see, the care-based ethics, as she called it, is actually superior to the male voice, or as she's going to call it, justice-based ethics. It is better, according to her. She says, look, justice-based ethics, that's usually associated as masculine, rational. It's not psychologically informed. Oh, you would pull the lever to kill your mom and save the 5? Sure you would, she would say. Principle-based, you apply the rule and sort of just move on. Emotions just get in the way. Guilt, you're supposed to sort of overcome those. And there's no favoritism allowed. In care-based ethics, that's according to her, feminine, sympathy-based. And again, it's feminine either because of nature or nurture. And she does believe that men are capable of care-based ethics. Keep that in mind. She doesn't think that this is an exclusively woman thing. She thinks that women and men will both benefit from adopting this superior ethics, care-based ethics, but that has been traditionally been dominated by women. It's psychologically informed. We look at what you would actually psychologically do in these situations, because your emotions actually have an important role to play. You should promote your relationships, right? And favoritism is expected, and not only something to overcome, it is morally correct, because relationships give rise to obligations. So not only should you promote relationships, because that makes you a more moral and caring and considerate person, and try to develop your relationships with the people you already have, as well as potential future people. But once you have those relationships, they give rise to weighty obligations that you wouldn't have to strangers. So that's actually where we're going to go ahead and pause today. As we're going to see in our next recorded lecture, Stephanie Collins is going to go ahead and, given all we've said today, try to distill the core of care ethics into 4 key claims. But with that said, that is it for today. I'll see you folks next time.